Welcome, my friend, wherever you are listening from tonight. Maybe you are lying in bed with the lights turned low, or sitting quietly in a chair with your eyes already feeling a little heavy. In this video, I will take you on a slow and gentle journey into a softer side of royal history, the kind of history that does not shout with battles and crowns, but whispers with fires, footsteps, and the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. We will walk together, very calmly, through the story of two special homes that belonged to a queen. Sandringham, in the flat, quiet fields of Norfolk, and Balmoral, hidden among the high, breathing hills of Scotland. As you listen, you will not need to remember dates or long, hard names. You can simply follow the feeling of the story, like following a candle flame in a dark room. You will hear about a king who spent his last winter days at Sandringham, looking out at cold lawns and hearing the sudden rush of pheasants in the frosty air, and about a queen who spent her happiest summers and her final days at Balmoral, wrapped in the small comforts of dogs at her feet, rain on the windows, and the soft smell of smoke and wool around her shoulders. In this story, we will not stand in loud glittering palaces. Instead, we will step inside rooms where the carpets are worn by real footsteps, where the chairs are simple and familiar, where clocks tick quietly on the mantels and fires crackle with low, sleepy sounds. We will feel the Norfolk winter at Sandringham, the pale sky stretching over flat fields, the frost shining faintly on the grass in the early morning, and the air so cold that every breath feels like a little cloud. Then we will travel north in our minds, up to Balmoral, where the land rises in slow, soft waves, where heather covers the hills in purple and brown, and where the rivers talk gently to the stones as they pass. You will hear about barbecues in the Scottish rain with glowing coals and sizzling embers, about the mui koi go and the muai len uhot that clung to coats and scarves, about evenings when the Queen could sit by an open fire outside, listening to the small sleepy song of burning wood, and feeling perhaps more like a simple grandmother than a ruler of a kingdom. As we move through this history, you will discover how these two homes were like two different heartbeats in the same chest. Sandringham, with its winter stillness and sad, gentle memories of a king's last breath, and Balmoral, with its summer and autumn peace, holding the laughter of children, the teasing of a husband, the quiet strength of a woman growing older, and at last the soft closing of her own story. I promise you that this will not be a harsh or heavy lesson. There will be no shouting, no rushing, no sharp edges. We will move slowly and kindly through time, letting each scene rise and fall like a calm wave. If at any moment your eyes begin to close, that is all right. You do not have to fight it. This story is here to keep you company as you drift, to give your mind a gentle place to wander, across frosted lawns in Norfolk, along misty paths in the Scottish Highlands, past windows glowing with warm light while the outside world grows quiet. By the end of this video, you will have walked the entire history of the Queen's two royal homes, from the last days of a tired king at Sandringham to the final peaceful breath of a long-lived queen at Balmoral. You will understand not just the facts of these places, but their feeling, the way the air tastes, the way the floors sound under soft footsteps, the way the walls hold memories like secrets. So, let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and simply listen. The fields of Norfolk and the hills of Scotland are waiting for you. And tonight, they will tell you a story of smoke, wool, silence, and home. On a quiet winter evening, long ago, but not too far from the world we know, a soft mist wrapped itself around the trees of Sandringham. The sky above Norfolk was a pale grey blanket, and the cold air moved slowly through the bare branches, carrying with it the distant rustle of wings. In that wide and silent estate, where fields met low forests and the earth smelled faintly of frost, a king was learning what it meant to feel less like a statue and more like a man. Inside the house, the light was gentle, not harsh or blinding, but warm and golden, as if it were trying to push back the chill that came from more than just the weather. The corridors were filled with the faint scent of wax polish and old wood, of coal smoke fading in the distance, and the silent echo of footsteps that had walked there for many years. And somewhere, in a room that was not too grand and not too small, George VI sat alone for a moment, listening to his own breathing, feeling the weight of his own tired body. Outside, in the fields around Sandringham, the air was sharper, the grass was damp and cold, and tiny drops of water clung to it like tiny beads of glass. From the hedgerows came the sudden burst of sound as pheasants lifted into the sky, their wings beating quickly, their calls sharp and startled. In the early mornings, when the sun was only a pale line on the horizon, they would strut along the edges of the fields, bright and nervous, like small living flames in the grey light. The estate seemed simple in those moments, almost ordinary, like the countryside of any quiet English village, and yet beneath that simple surface, every path, every tree, every whispering hedge carried the memory of crowns, promises, and burdens that could not be laid down. George VI knew this land well. He had walked it as a boy, when his legs were still strong and his heart still lighter. Sandringham was where he had learned to shoot, to ride, to breathe in the cold morning and feel that it belonged to him in a way that the crowded, echoing halls of palaces never quite did. In the city, he was the king, a figure on coins and stamps, a shape on a balcony. But here, in this house of brick and stone tucked among the fields, he could sometimes forget the crown and remember only the simple rhythm of waking, walking, eating, and listening to the wind outside the window. Perhaps that was why he said, in the quiet honesty that only comes when one is tired, that here he felt most like a human being and least like a monument. At Sandringham, the nights settled early in winter. By late afternoon, the light had already begun to fade, and shadows would grow long and soft across the lawns. Lamps would flicker on one by one inside, turning the windows into squares of pale amber set into the dark walls. Servants moved quietly, their steps careful on the polished floors, and the murmur of voices was low, respectful, never wanting to disturb the fragile calm that seemed to hang over the house. If one listened closely near the great front steps, one might hear the faint clatter of hooves in the stable yard, or the distant bark of a dog eager for one last run before the true darkness came. Sometimes, when the cold pressed too sharply against the windows, the king would sit near the fire and let his eyes rest on the flames. The burning logs were not grand, not arranged for show, but simply there to give warmth. The smoke had a dry, earthy smell, and it stuck lightly to clothes and curtains. In that gentle orange light, the lines on his face seemed deeper, but also softer, as if the fire were smoothing away the hard edges of duty, and leaving behind only a man who had tried, in his own quiet way, to do what was right. Outside that small circle of warmth, the world of speeches, ceremonies, and war reports felt very far away. On some days, the wind over Sandringham came with a sharper voice. It rattled at the windows and pushed through the trees, making them sway and creak as though they were whispering to each other. The pheasants in the fields would scatter, their calls sharper, their bodies a sudden blur of motion against the dull colours of winter. The soil underfoot would be firm and cold, and the ponds would hold thin layers of ice that cracked softly at the touch of a boot. Yet even on those rougher days, there was a kind of peace woven into the landscape, a sense that the land had seen kings come and go and would continue to stand quiet and unchanged, long after every crown had turned to dust. It was in this setting that George VI spent his final days, his body weaker, his breath shorter, but his heart still tied to this place that had watched him grow, stumble, and stand again. There were doctors, of course, and worried faces, and currents of concern that moved beneath the surface of the household like an unseen tide. But there were also simple sounds: the ticking of a clock on the mantel, the faint rattle of branches against the glass, the soft rustle of paper as someone folded a letter. Life went on in small ways, even as it slowly changed in greater ones. Somewhere, a maid adjusted flowers in a vase and a footman checked the fire. Outside, the pheasants went on calling in the cold. For those who served him closely, it was not easy to watch the king fade in the place he loved most. Yet there was also a strange tender rightness to it. He was not alone in a distant glittering palace or a foreign land. He was at Sandringham, where his footsteps had worn the paths, where family voices had echoed in the rooms, where the air knew his scent and the walls remembered the sounds of his laughter. The house held him gently, the way an old coat holds the shape of the one who has worn it for many years. As his strength lessened, the world outside his room seemed to grow quieter, as if the estate itself were holding its breath. The winter sky remained pale and wide. The trees stood like dark guardians against the horizon, and the fields stretched away in calm, empty lines. On certain mornings, a light fog would roll across the lawns, softening everything it touched, making even the brick walls of the house look almost like a dream. In those moments, one could almost imagine that the borders between past and present had grown thin, and that the boy he once was walked beside the man he had become, retracing the same steps along the same paths. In time, the day came when the king's breathing slowed, and then, at last, became still. The news would go out to the nation, to distant cities and far-off lands, but here, in Sandringham, the first sign of change was simply a deeper silence. The fire still burned, the clock still ticked, but there was a new emptiness in the air, a space where a human presence had been. Outside, the pheasants still called, ignoring the sorrow of humans, living by their own simple laws. The land, patient and ancient, accepted another story into its memory. And so in that quiet corner of Norfolk, a chapter of royal life closed not with the noise of trumpets, but with the soft breath of a winter sky and the gentle rustle of wings in the fields, while far to the north, beyond the flat farmlands and busy roads, another landscape waited in the high, wild hills of Scotland, ready to welcome other seasons, other summers, and another queen who would find her deepest peace among its stones and streams. Far to the north, where the land rises and folds into great quiet hills, another home waited in the changing light of the Scottish sky. Balmoral did not sit in gentle flat fields like Sandringham, but nestled among the highlands, wrapped in dark green forests and purple heather, with cold streams that talked softly to the stones as they passed. The air there was different from Norfolk's damp winter breath. It carried the sharp, clean scent of pine and wet earth, and on many days a faint trace of smoke that drifted from chimneys and open fires, curling into the mist like a slow, sleepy sigh. When the family came north, the world around them seemed to loosen its collar. The stiff lines of state, the endless rooms of palaces, the crowds and cameras and careful words, all grew distant, as if they belonged to another life. Here, in this valley of grass and rock, they could walk in old coats and worn boots, their footsteps mixing with the soft prints of deer and the tiny marks of birds along the path. The sky often wore a veil of low cloud, and when the rain came, it fell in thin, steady threads that soaked into wool and soil, leaving behind that special smell of wet wool and smoke, the quiet perfume of Balmoral. Inside the stone house, the rooms were not grand in the way of London palaces. They felt lived in, with shelves of books, framed photographs, and the marks of many summers and many small, ordinary days. In the drawing room, the furniture was comfortable rather than impressive, and the carpets carried the faint memory of muddy boots and dogs that had shaken off the rain after long walks. On chill evenings, fires burned in the grates, the logs crackling softly, sending flickers of light along the walls. The smoke from the hearth mixed with the smell of wool clothes drying by the door, and together they wrapped the house in a kind of gentle, homely warmth. Outside, in the open, another fire often came to life. On the grass, sometimes under a simple shelter, when the weather threatened rain, coals would be piled and lit, slowly turning from black to glowing red. Prince Philip would stand near them, sleeves perhaps pushed back a little, hands busy with tongs and skewers, his face half shadowed by rising smoke. The sound of the coals was a steady, comforting hiss and crackle, like a pot of quiet thunder kept carefully under control. Fat from sausages or cuts of meat would drip down onto the glowing embers, sending up tiny bursts of flame, and a smell so rich and strong that it mingled with the Highland air and made even the quiet hills seem a little warmer. Around him, the family moved in ways that felt more like any other family than like the figures on stamps and coins. Children's voices rose and fell, sometimes laughing, sometimes calling out to each other as they ran over the uneven ground. Dogs chased scents none of the humans could detect, their tails drawing quick shapes through the mist. A simple table might be set nearby, covered not with golden plates or crystal, but with sturdy dishes, mugs, and plates that could bear the touch of wind and weather. There might be a tartan blanket thrown over a bench, its pattern softened by use and time, still holding the faint smell of rain and the memory of shoulders it had warmed. The Queen, who in other places moved like a quiet centre of ceremony, here could simply sit, perhaps with a scarf folded around her hair and a thick cardigan over her dress. She could watch the hills change colour as the light shifted, could feel the chill of the air on her cheeks, could wrap her hands around a warm mug and listen to the sounds of her family instead of the calls of crowds. It was said that she loved Balmoral more than any palace, and it was easy to understand why. Here, her footsteps did not echo through marble halls, but brushed softly against grass and gravel. Here, the land did not demand anything of her. It simply received her as it received the wind, the rain, and the quiet grazing of deer. In the evenings, when the meal was almost ready, the air around the outdoor fire would grow thick with the scent of wood smoke and cooked meat. The grey curls of smoke would weave themselves into hair and clothes, so that later, inside, one could still smell the echo of the flames on a sleeve or a scarf, the texture of wool, warmed by body heat and dampened by light drizzle, seemed to hold those smells especially well. It was as if each fibre remembered the day, the laughter, the cold air, and the orange glow of the coals. And when the last pieces of meat had been taken from the grill, the embers slowly fading from bright to dull, the sound they made, those soft, tiny pops and sighs, seemed to whisper that the day was gently closing its eyes. In the deeper silence that followed, one might hear the river in the distance, or the call of a bird overhead, or simply the wind moving through the heather. It was a silence that did not feel empty, but full of stories, of years, of footsteps that had come before and would come after. If someone were lying awake in a room at Balmoral, wrapped in blankets while the rain pattered softly against the window, they might smell that same mix of wool and smoke and feel that they were part of a quiet, secret world, far from the shouts and lights of cities. And perhaps, somewhere far away, another listener in another country might be lying in their own room, lights low, headphones on, listening to these gentle tales of royal houses and quiet hills. If that listener felt their eyes growing heavier, their breath slower, and their hearts softer as they travelled in their imagination through Norfolk fields and Scottish Highlands, then this story had already done a small kindness. And if, in the hush of their own room, they felt a wish to keep walking these calm paths, night after night, they could choose, very quietly, to stay close, to follow, to subscribe in their heart and on their screen, so that more of these old sleepy stories could find them again. For the life of a family, even a royal one, is not only made of crowns and ceremonies, but of these small, smoky evenings, of fingers warmed over coals, of boots left by the door, still wet from the grass. Years would pass, children would grow, seasons would turn, and each summer and autumn the family would return to Balmoral like birds that remembered their nesting place. The hills watched without judgment, the stones kept their secrets, and the house learned to hold all these quiet moments, the laughter, the worries, the private tears. One day, far in the future, this same house and these same rooms would bear witness to another ending, as gentle and solemn as the one that had unfolded at Sandringham. But for now, in this part of the story, the fires still burned, the coals still whispered, and the Queen still walked the paths of her beloved Highland home, while beyond the horizon time moved slowly forward, carrying with it both the sweet taste of ordinary days and the soft, inevitable approach of the last chapter waiting in the wings. Between these two quiet corners of the kingdom, life moved like a slow, familiar tide for the family who belonged to both. Sandringham and Balmoral were not just places on a map. They were like two different kinds of breath in the same chest, one sharp with winter air and flat fields, the other deep and cool with highland mist. For the people who lived under crowns and titles, these estates were less about gold and marble, and more about the simple, steady rhythm of days that could almost be called ordinary. When the royal train or convoy left the noise of London behind, there was always a change in the air long before the carriages reached the gate. On the way to Sandringham, the houses grew smaller, the roads narrower, and the sky wider. The land flattened out, opening into fields and hedgerows. In winter, those fields often looked soft and grey, as if the earth were wrapped in a thin blanket of cold. Sometimes a light fog would hover close to the ground, and the headlights would carve thin tunnels through it as the cars rolled forward. The closer they came, the more familiar the shapes became. A certain line of trees on the horizon, a bend in the road, the outline of the house itself emerging through the mist like something remembered from childhood. To the staff at Sandringham, the arrival of the family was a kind of quiet festival. There were no cheering crowds or blaring horns, only a little more light in the corridors, a few extra fires lit, rooms dusted and checked again. Beds were turned down with care, hot water bottles sometimes slipped between sheets on the coldest nights. The kitchen woke early and slept late, sending out the smells of roasting meat, baking bread, and soups that steamed in thick, comforting clouds. In the mornings, someone might open a back door to let in a bit of fresh air, and with it would come the thin, crisp smell of frost and the far-off sound of wings beating as pheasants crossed the fields. At Balmoral, the feeling of arrival was different but just as deep. The road there climbed and curved, carrying cars between rising slopes where the colours changed with the seasons. In late summer and early autumn, the heather could turn the hills into soft purple waves. In winter, Snow sometimes spilled down the slopes, catching on rocks and branches, making the whole world look as if it had paused for breath. When the family came, the house seemed to sit up a little straighter, like an old friend who was pleased to see familiar faces. Smoke would slip from the chimneys, and the smell of burning wood would mix with the scent of wet leaves and moss. Inside, boots thumped softly on stone floors, dogs barked with joy, and voices echoed down hallways that were used to them. For the children who grew up between these two homes, the memories were not of ceremonies but of textures and sounds. At Sandringham, there was the feeling of cold air on bare hands while feeding horses or walking the dogs, the crackle of thin ice under boots near ponds edged with reeds, the sudden burst of pheasants taking flight, leaving only a few drop feathers behind. At Balmoral, there was the rasp of bracken against legs during long walks, the chill of river water on fingertips when someone stooped to touch the surface, the way wet wool scratched a little at the neck while keeping the rest of the body warm. These were the small physical details that stayed long after the speeches and state papers had faded. Yet even in these quiet places, the weight of history was never far away. At Sandringham, every room seemed to remember the last days of George VI, the chair where he had once rested, the window he might have looked through to see the winter sky, the corridor where footsteps slowed on the day the doctors grew more serious. All of these held an invisible layer of memory, like a second, softer shadow. Those who came after could feel it sometimes, not as a cold heaviness, but as a calm reminder that even kings are mortal, even crowns must bow to time. At Balmoral, the memories were of laughter and summer evenings, of photographs taken on the grass, with mountains watching from behind, of barbecues where smoke curled around faces that rarely showed themselves so unguarded in public. But there was also the knowledge that one day this place too would mark an ending. Perhaps the house itself knew. Perhaps the stones that had watched the young princess walk the lawns with her parents understood that they would also see her as an old woman, tired but still steady, when the last chapter arrived. On some days, the contrast between the two estates felt especially strong. At Sandringham in winter, the sky could press low and grey, the air heavy, with the promise of snow that might or might not come. The land was quiet, the colours muted, and the house felt like a shelter against the chill, a place where the world grew smaller and time folded inward. At Balmoral, even on a cloudy day, the landscape seemed to open upward. The hills rose in long, gentle lines, drawing the eye up to the changing sky. The wind moved more freely there, tugging at scarves and hair, reminding anyone who stepped outside that they were small in the face of nature's old patience. Yet both places shared something important. They allowed the members of the royal family to be people first and symbols second. At Sandringham, a king could sit by the fire and feel his body grow tired without needing to hide it behind ceremony. At Balmoral, a queen could walk with her dogs, her steps unhurried, her face turned to the wind without thinking of cameras or speeches. In these houses, the crown rested on a hook by the door, at least in spirit, while boots and coats took its place. For those who served them, this mixture of the ordinary and the historic could feel strange but also natural. A maid might straighten sheets in a room where great decisions had been thought through in private. A gardener might trim roses outside a window where news of war and peace had been received. A cook might stir soup in a pot, while hearing, carried faintly through the house, the same voice that had spoken to millions through a radio or television. Life went on in tasks and routines, even as history whispered through the walls. As the years moved forward, these estates slowly became more than private refuges. They turned into symbols, in the minds of people who had never walked their paths. To some, Sandringham was the place where a weary king found his last moments of peace. To others, Balmoral was the image of a queen in a headscarf and tweed, smiling in the rain with her dogs at her heels. These pictures were not painted in bright, sharp colours, but in the soft tones of memory, family, and the deep longing for somewhere safe and quiet in a noisy world. And still, the seasons turned. Frost came and went in Norfolk. Heather bloomed and faded in Scotland. New generations grew, learned to ride, to walk the same paths, to breathe the same smells of smoke and wet wool, of cold soil and summer grass. The land watched them all, with calm patience, holding their stories without shouting them aloud. Somewhere, in the gentle space between these two homes, a question slowly formed, like a cloud taking shape on the horizon. When the final goodbyes came for this long-serving queen, which of these beloved places would cradle her last breath, and how would the world feel that loss through the stones, the smoke, and the quiet hills that had loved her back in silence, while, for now, the fires still burned, the dogs still ran, and the doors of Sandringham and Balmoral still opened to welcome her footsteps home. As the years slipped by, like pages turned gently in a long, careful book, the bond between the Queen and her two quiet homes grew deeper and more layered. She had first known Sandringham as a young princess, coming to visit her grandparents, learning the shapes of the rooms and the rhythms of winter days. She had known Balmoral as a place of summer light and highland rain, where her parents had smiled more freely, where duty seemed to loosen its grip just a little. Now, as she grew older, and the weight of time settled more firmly on her shoulders, these two estates held not just her own memories, but the echoes of those who had walked before her. At Sandringham, each winter visit was like returning to an old chapter she knew by heart. The drive through the Norfolk countryside felt slower than before, not because the road had changed, but because her body had. Yet the sight of the house, with its familiar brick and stone, its chimneys reaching up into the pale sky, still stirred a soft warmth in her chest. She remembered her father there, the way he had moved through those rooms with quiet bravery, carrying his own fears and pains with more courage than he ever claimed to possess. When she walked the same corridors, her footsteps gentle on the carpets, she sometimes felt as though he walked beside her, unseen but present, showing her how to go on even when the days were hard. The staff, many of whom had served her for years, noticed the changes too. They saw how she now used a stick to steady herself on uneven ground, how she moved a little more carefully when stepping in or out of cars. But they also saw the way her eyes softened when she looked out at the winter fields, watching the pale light spread over the grass. On frosty mornings, when the air was so cold it seemed to ring like glass, she might stand for a moment at a window and watch the pheasants picking their careful way along the hedgerows. She knew the sound of their sudden flight, the beat of their wings, the way their colours flashed against the grey. These were not grand moments meant for history books, but they were the threads that stitched her life to this place. At Balmoral, the years showed themselves in different ways. The hills she had once climbed with long, strong strides now seemed steeper. The rivers she had crossed on stepping stones now demanded a helping hand or a slower path around. But still she came, year after year, drawn by something deeper than habit. The sight of the castle nestled among its trees, the hills rising behind it like old guardians, still brought her a feeling that was almost like home and almost like freedom. Here she could still pull on a headscarf, a simple coat and sturdy shoes, and step out into the highland air. The smell of pine needles underfoot and the sharp, cool breath of the wind were like old friends welcoming her back. The muai koi go still hung in the air on many evenings, rising from chimneys and from the outdoor fires where meals were cooked under open skies. Even as her pace slowed, she loved to watch the familiar ritual of the barbecue. There was Prince Philip at the grill in older days, busy and focused, sparks flying up as fat dropped onto the hot coals. Later, there were others who took his place at the fire, but the sound remained the same. The gentle hiss and crackle of burning wood, the soft pop of embers shifting, the whispered song of dan kui chai, cheo cheo, under the food. The smell was rich and comforting, sinking into the fabric of wool jackets and tartan blankets, clinging to her clothes so that even hours after the fire was out, she could still catch its ghost on her sleeve. On rainy days, Balmoral wrapped itself in a deeper hush. Clouds pressed low over the hills, and the mist crept in close among the trees, turning the world into a soft, blurred painting of greys and greens. Wool coats and cardigans grew heavy with damp, the Muai Len Uot rising whenever someone came inside and hung their things near the door. That scent of wet wool and smoke and cold air became, over time, one of the clearest signatures of her Highland refuge. It carried not only the memory of weather, but of laughter around simple tables, of long talks with family, of quiet moments, watching the world grow older outside the window. In private, the Queen understood what few, outside her circle, ever fully saw, that these places, which seemed so simple, were also full of ghosts, not frightening ones, but gentle, beloved presences. At Sandringham, her father's last days lay over the house like a thin veil. At Balmoral, her happiest summers with her husband and children shimmered in the corners of every room. Sometimes, when she sat alone in a chair near the fire, hands folded in her lap, she could almost hear the echoes of voices from years ago, the excited chatter of young children, the low rumble of Philip's teasing remarks, the bark of dogs, now long gone. The flames would move and shift before her, and she would listen to the soft crackle as if it were the language of time itself, speaking in a tongue only she could fully understand. Outside the walls of these homes, the world grew louder and more restless. News travelled faster, opinions rose and fell like sudden storms, and the idea of royalty was questioned, studied, defended, and debated again and again. But inside Sandringham and Balmoral, life took a slower shape. The routines remained. Breakfast at certain hours, walks at certain times of day, letters read and answered, documents reviewed. The crown did not disappear here. It never could, but it rested more lightly. In these rooms, she could be not just a queen, but a mother, a grandmother, an old woman with sore feet and tired bones who still loved the feel of a good dog's fur under her hand and the sound of rain at night. For those looking back on her life, it might one day seem strange that such grand stories of power and duty could be so closely tied to simple things: a muddy boot, a woolen blanket, the smell of koi go in autumn air. Yet, perhaps that was where the real magic lay. These were the details that made her human, that tied her to the people she served, many of whom also knew the comfort of small fires, wet coats hung to dry, and silent fields that watched the seasons turn. As age drew her more tightly into its careful hands, the question of where she would spend her last days began to feel less like a public matter and more like a whispered promise between her and the land she loved. Sandringham had cradled her father at the end. Balmoral had held so much of her private joy. Each place called to different parts of her heart, like two quiet songs drifting across the same water. And somewhere in that gentle pull between Norfolk's flat fields and Scotland's rising hills, a choice was slowly, silently forming. A choice that would one day turn one of these peaceful houses into the final chapter of her story and leave the scent of smoke, the softness of wool, and the hush of old stone, holding the last breath of a queen who had always found her deepest peace far from the noise of the throne. In the soft stretch of her later years, the Queen moved between Sandringham and Balmoral like someone walking between two familiar rooms of the same quiet house. Each place carried its own voice, its own taste in the air. At Sandringham, the winters pressed close, and the memory of her father rested on every window and corridor. At Balmoral, the Highland light shifted across the hills, and the ghosts of summers past walked alongside her with gentle unseen steps. She did not need to speak aloud about the choice that waited somewhere ahead of her. The land understood without words. When she arrived at Sandringham in the colder months, the air greeted her with that special Norfolk chill, a kind of clean, flat cold that seeped slowly into the bones. The sky was often wide and pale, as if the clouds had been stretched thin across it. On some mornings, a riu geolan would pass through the bare branches and rattle at the glass, and she would stand for a moment by a window, watching the grey light spill across the lawns. The house smelled of polished wood, coal smoke, an old stone that had held the breath of many winters. Somewhere in another room, a clock ticked quietly, its tiny, steady sound marking the slow passing of days. In those moments, she felt the weight of her years, but also the firmness of the ground under her feet. This was where her father had faced his own ending. This was where he had been not mainly a king, but a man who coughed, who tired easily, who looked out at the same winter sky and felt both fear and peace. When she walked past the rooms he had known best, she did so with a kind of silent respect, as if not to disturb his lingering presence. Sandringham was like a memory made solid, a place where past and present touched hands in the dim light of short days. Balmoral, by contrast, always met her with movement. Even on the stillest days, there was a sense that the hills were breathing, that the rivers were murmuring their endless talk to the stones. When the car rolled up the drive and the castle came into view, tucked among its trees, she always felt something in her chest loosen, as if a tight knot had been gently undone. The air was sharper here, clearer. It carried the green scent of pine and the damp softness of moss. Often, even before she stepped inside, she could smell a faint thread of coy go drifting from some chimney or from the open coals of an outdoor fire. On evenings when the weather allowed, she would watch as the family gathered around the barbecue. The coals glowed red and orange, their heat rising in silent waves. The thanchai, cheo cheo, when fat dripped onto them, sending up little bursts of flame. The smoke wrapped itself around everyone's clothes, sinking deep into woolen hair, leaving that unforgettable huang vihawangia of wood smoke and len wat that seemed to belong only to Balmoral. When she later hung her coat on the back of a chair or folded a scarf over a bedpost, she could still smell it and feel, for a moment, as if she were back out under the open sky, listening to the crackle of coals and the soft laughter of family. The world beyond these estates watched her from a distance through screens and headlines. People saw the bright colours of her coats, the careful wave of her hand, the calm, practised smile. They heard speeches, saw ceremonies, and read about duties that never seemed to end. But very few could ever truly imagine what it felt like to sit quietly in a simple chair at Balmoral, with tired feet propped on a footstool, listening to the subtle music of a Highland evening, a kettle whispering on the boil, rain tapping lightly against the window, a dog sighing in its sleep near the fire. Very few could imagine the way the smell of len, uo and koi go could bring back 1,000 small memories at once. Philip's voice, the sound of children running in from the rain, the feeling of a damp headscarf clinging gently to her hair. Sometimes, as she moved through these private rooms, she carried with her the knowledge that many people in many countries longed for a refuge like this, a place where history was not only in books, but in the way the floor creaked in certain spots, in the way the light always fell a certain way on a favourite chair, in the way a certain tree outside the window had grown from a sapling into a tall guardian over the years. Perhaps that was why, for some listeners far away, the very names Sandringham and Balmoral sounded almost like lullabies. They were not just estates. They were dreams of quiet corners in a noisy world, and somewhere out there, in a darkened room or on a silent bus ride at night, someone might be listening to these stories with their eyes half closed, breathing a little slower, feeling the pull of sleep as they walked in their minds through frosty fields and misty highland paths. For that unseen listener, the Queen's two homes could become gentle doorways into rest. If, in that drowsy space, they felt a wish to keep returning to these slow, candle-lit journeys through history and human hearts, they could let that wish take a small shape. Perhaps a quiet click to follow or subscribe. A simple way of saying, yes, I want to keep walking these paths with you, night after night. Just as the Queen kept returning to her beloved houses, the listener could return to these tales whenever the world felt too loud. In the end, the choice that waited for her, where to spend her last days, was not only a royal question, but a deeply human one. It was about where her heart felt most at rest, where the layers of her life lay thickest and kindest. Sandringham held the gentle sorrow of her father's last winter and the strong, steady love she had carried for him ever since. Balmoral held the bright threads of summers, the strength of mountains, the laughter and teasing of her husband, the growing up of her children, the long, reflective walks of her later years. Both were woven into her like two colours in the same cloth. As her hair grew whiter and her steps shorter, she began to lean more often toward the Highland air. The trips to Balmoral became, in some quiet way, less of a holiday and more of a homecoming. Sitting by the window in a simple room, looking out at the hills disappearing into soft cloud, she would sometimes rest her hand on the arm of the chair and simply listen to the ticking of a nearby clock, to the faint hiss of a distant fire, to the slow, steady beat of her own heart. The smell of smoke and wool hung gently around her like an invisible shawl. Outside, the river ran on. The heather nodded in the wind, and the stones kept their long, patient watch. Somewhere in that deep, unhurried landscape, the answer to her unspoken question waited like a path disappearing into the mist, ready, when the time came, to lead her toward one last quiet season in the place where the hills, the smoke, and the soft highland air had always known her best. While far away in their own silent rooms, listeners would one day hear the news and close their eyes, imagining the scent of Coy Go and Len Wat that had wrapped itself around the final chapter of a long and gentle reign. In the last stretch of her journey, the rhythm of her days at Balmoral and Sandringham became quieter, simpler, but also more precious, as if time itself were walking more softly beside her. She woke earlier than she used to, not because she had to, but because her body no longer needed long, heavy sleep. In those early hours, when the light was still thin and the world had not yet fully stirred, she often found her clearest moments of peace. At Sandringham, dawn came gently, spreading a pale milky light across the flat fields. The grass outside shone with beads of frost or dew, and the bare trees stood like thin ink lines drawn against the sky. If she looked carefully from her window, she might catch the faint movement of pheasants stepping carefully through the hedgerows, their heads jerking up and down as they searched for food. Their sudden flights, when startled by some unseen sound, still made her jump a little, even after so many years. Inside, the house woke slowly. A kettle hissed in the kitchen, pipes sighed in the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a vacuum hummed briefly before falling silent again. The air in the corridors carried the clean, cool scent of stone and polish, with just a trace of yesterday's fire lingering like a forgotten thought. She walked these halls with measured steps, one hand sometimes brushing along a familiar panel or doorframe, as if to greet the house itself. Each corner held a small memory, a conversation, a piece of news, a moment of shared laughter or quiet worry. Sandringham was where she remembered the weight of duty most clearly, but also where she remembered the simple courage of those who had carried it before her. When the time came to go north again, the journey to Balmoral felt almost like travelling into another world. The flat lines of Norfolk gave way to rising slopes and winding roads. The colour of the land changed, shifting from gentle browns and greys to deeper greens and purples. Even the light seemed different in Scotland, more changeable, more alive, slipping between sun and shadow in a single afternoon. When the car finally turned into the long drive and the castle appeared between the trees, she always felt the same quiet recognition, like seeing an old friend waiting patiently at a gate. The first breath of Highland air, taken as she stepped out, always tasted a little sharper, cooler, edged with the smell of leaves, water, and distant smoke. Inside Balmoral, the rooms greeted her like rooms that knew her well. The carpets had borne her footsteps for decades. The walls had listened to countless private conversations. On tables and mantels, framed photographs showed younger faces. Hers, Philip's, the children, as they once were, laughing at some small joke, squinting against the sun, hair blown by the wind. Sometimes she paused to look at them more closely, noticing small details she had long forgotten. The way a scarf had been tied, the tilt of a hat, the way a hand had rested on a shoulder. These images were like windows into summers that seemed both far away and strangely close, as if she could reach out and touch them through the glass. The house, too, remembered. In rainy weather, it wrapped itself in the smell of Len Uot, rising from coats and jumpers hung up to dry near radiators and doors. That scent, mingled with the mui koi go that slipped in from fireplaces and the outdoor barbecue, forming a kind of invisible cloak around the rooms. In the evenings, the soft crackle of logs in the grate became a familiar heartbeat, steady and low. When someone opened a door, a cooler breath of air would slide in, carrying the faint echo of the hills outside, the whisper of trees, the distant rush of a river, the silent watch of the stones. On days when the weather allowed, the old ritual of eating outside continued. Even if she no longer stood near the fire for long, she liked to sit where she could see it. The coals glowed like small captured suns, and the Thun Kui Chai Sheo Cheo, under the dripping fat, still sang its quiet song of warmth and hunger. Smoke curled around faces, drew lines through the air, and left its mark on everyone's clothes. Later, when she sat alone in a chair by a window, she would sometimes lift a sleeve to her face and breathe in that smoky, woolly scent, and it would bring back not only the meal, but all the years of similar evenings, the voices, the jokes, the shared silences. In these late years, she found herself thinking more often not just of her own memories, but of what these places meant to others. She knew that for many people far away, Sandringham and Balmoral were not detailed maps in their minds, but feelings. Sandringham felt like winter quiet, the hush of frosted fields, the breath of a king fading into stillness. Balmoral felt like Highland calm, the embrace of hills, the smell of wet wool and smoke, The sight of a queen in a simple headscarf walking slowly along a path. Perhaps, she sometimes thought, these images gave comfort to people who would never step into these rooms, the way stories of other lands and times had once comforted her as a child. Outside the walls of Balmoral, the world continued its turning. Governments changed. Storms and celebrations filled the news. Voices rose and fell in praise and in criticism. Inside, her days were shaped by quiet tasks, reading reports, signing papers, listening to counsellors, writing small notes in her careful, familiar hand. Between these duties there were moments of deep stillness, sitting with a book that she sometimes did not read, watching a shaft of light move slowly across the carpet, feeling the weight of a sleeping dog against her foot. In that stillness, the question of her final resting place no longer felt like a public matter at all. It felt instead like something between her and the land, between her and the ghosts who walked beside her unseen. Sandringham whispered of beginnings and endings, of a father's last winter and a daughter's first heavy crown. Balmoral whispered of the long middle of life, of partnership, of family, of growing old, with the same hills watching patiently from year to year. When she lay awake, on certain nights, at Balmoral, listening to the soft rush of wind outside and the faint ticking of a clock on the mantel, she sometimes felt that the house itself was breathing with her, slow and steady. The shadows moved gently along the walls as the fire settled deeper into embers. The smell of Coy Go and Len Watt wrapped her like a blanket that no one could see. In that half-dark, half-light, she was not a figure on stamps or a face on television. She was simply an old woman whose life had been very long and very full, who had loved and been loved, who had carried heavy burdens and found small, quiet joys under grey skies and in green valleys. And somewhere in that deep quiet, without any need for words, the choice of where her story would close grew clearer, like the slow revealing of a path in the mist. It would not come today or tomorrow, but it would come all the same, as it comes for every human being, crowned or not. The hills knew it. The rivers knew it. The stones under the foundations of Balmoral knew it best of all, waiting with endless patience to hold the last echoes of her footsteps. While far beyond those highland slopes, in bedrooms and bus seats and quiet corners of the world, listeners drifted towards sleep to the imagined smell of smoke and wool, following her gentle shadow along the paths of the estates that had shaped her heart, not knowing that, even as they dreamed, another, quieter chapter was already beginning to unfold. Long before the final chapter quietly unfolded, the names Sandringham and Balmoral had already taken root in the hearts of people who would never walk their corridors or breathe their particular air. They were more than private estates. They had become, over time, almost like two lanterns glowing in the same long night of a nation's story. Through radio, through television, through photographs in newspapers and on glowing screens, the world had been invited again and again to share small glimpses of these places, where the Queen moved not as a distant symbol, but as a person surrounded by familiar walls and familiar skies. At Sandringham, millions had once listened to a young king's voice coming through the radio, uncertain at first, then steadier with each passing year. Later, they listened to his daughter. The Christmas broadcast, spoken from a quiet room with carefully arranged flowers and a simple desk, became a kind of yearly heartbeat. People across the country sat in their own living rooms, sometimes near their own small fires, the smell of their own Coy Go rising from modest hearths. As they listened to her calm, measured words, some of them might have glanced at their curtains and windows and wondered what the Norfolk sky looked like that day, where the frost lay on the lawns, whether the pheasants had called that morning. whether the same pale winter light that touched their own streets was resting on the brick and stone of Sandringham too. In those brief messages, the distance between palace and cottage shrank to the length of a human voice, moving through the air. And though people could not see the corridor she had walked down just before sitting at the microphone, or the quiet nod she might have given to a member of staff, or the way she perhaps took a slow breath to steady herself before speaking, they felt something of that unseen world in the careful calm of her tone. Sandringham, for them, became a place where words of comfort and reflection floated out each winter, drifting over cities and fields like a soft, steady snowfall. Balmoral, meanwhile, entered the public imagination through different images. There were photographs of the Queen in a headscarf, in tweed or simple coats, sometimes with a walking stick, often with dogs circling her feet like small, loyal shadows. There were glimpses of her standing beside Prince Philip near the outdoor grill, smoke rising around them as if the hills themselves were sending up prayers into the sky. There were scenes of her leaving or arriving at Crathie Kirk, the small stone church near the estate, her face serious but peaceful, the Scottish air pressing gently around her. For many, Balmoral came to mean a kind of royal privacy that still felt strangely shared, as if by seeing those images they could almost smell the muai koi go and len uot that clung to the Queen's clothes after a rainy walk, could almost hear the ching, then chui chai, cheo cheo under her dinner as it cooked over glowing coals. As the decades rolled by, the story of her reign began to loop back on itself in quiet, almost hidden ways. Older people remembered the shock of 1952, when news spread that George VI had died at Sandringham. They remembered headlines, solemn voices, the hush that fell over radios and living rooms. They did not see the small details of that morning in Norfolk, the way the frost might have still clung to the grass, the way a maid's hands shook slightly as she polished silver, the way someone paused for just a heartbeat longer than usual before knocking on a door. But they felt the weight of it, a king's last breath taken not in a golden hall, but in a familiar room overlooking quiet fields. Younger generations, growing up under the long shadow of his daughter's reign, sometimes forgot how unusual that kind of ending really was. They saw her as if she had always been there, steady as a clock, constant as the turning of the year. Yet the pattern of her life had always carried those two places in its weave. Sandringham, the winter refuge of memory and duty. Balmoral, the summer and autumn sanctuary, where the boundaries between queen and woman blurred into something gentler and more human. And as time moved forward, a strange, almost poetic symmetry began to form in the minds of those who paid close attention. A father who died at Sandringham, a daughter who loved Balmoral more than any palace, a family for whom the great turning points of private life often happened not in London's grand rooms, but in these quieter corners where mud clung to boots and smoke sank into wool. Sometimes, when the Queen visited Sandringham in her later years, those around her could sense how much of the past walked beside her. The house held his memory so firmly that it was impossible to step down certain corridors without feeling the ghost of that February morning in 1952. The staff understood this, even if it was never spoken aloud. The way she paused near a certain window, the way her gaze lingered on a particular door. These small gestures spoke a language of remembrance that needed no translation. At Balmoral, the ghosts were different. They were not of sudden endings, but of long sunlit middles. Philip's laughter carried away on the wind, children running over heather, dogs racing ahead on narrow paths, evenings where the sky refused to darken completely and hung instead in a soft blue twilight for hours. The house was saturated with these memories, like wool soaked through with rain. When she sat by the window and looked out at the hills, she was not just seeing the present landscape. She was seeing layers of time stacked softly upon one another, each year resting on the shoulders of the last, as her health began. Very slowly, to show the touch of age more clearly, the nation watched from afar with a mixture of concern and quiet acceptance. Reports of mobility issues and light duties floated through the news. A cancelled event here, a shorter walk there. People wondered in their own homes and conversations where the final page of her story would turn. Some thought of Windsor with its long corridors and ancient stones. Others thought of Buckingham Palace, the famous balcony that had framed so many moments of public joy. But in the hearts of those who had been listening closely to the deeper music of her life, another thought grew stronger. Perhaps, when the time came, it would be one of the two quieter houses that would hold her last breath. Sandringham, with its frost and pheasants, and the echo of her father's final days. Or Balmoral, with its hills, its rivers, its moai Govalen Uot, wrapped around chairs and coats like an invisible embrace. And while the public speculated in gentle, respectful tones, she moved through those houses with the calm of someone who knew that every story, even the longest and most carefully told, must one day find its closing line. She did not rush toward it. She did not speak of it loudly. Instead, she walked a little more slowly through familiar rooms, listened a little longer to the wind in the trees, sat a little more quietly by the fire as the than kui chai, xeo, settled into a soft, glowing bed of embers. The choice within her heart ripened without sound, like fruit darkening on a high branch. And somewhere, far beyond the walls of both estates, the world continued its noisy turning, unaware that the lines between Sandringham and Balmoral, between beginning and ending, between winter quiet and Highland peace, were drawing ever closer, until, in a not-so-distant September, the path she had been slowly, gently walking toward would finally open before her, leading her back to the Highland home that had waited, patient as stone, to cradle the last tender pages of her long and faithful reign. When the September finally came, it did not arrive with trumpets or with any grand sign, but with the same quiet, shifting light that always touched the Highlands at the edge of summer. The days were a little shorter, the evenings a little cooler, and the hills around Balmoral seemed to breathe in more deeply, as if drawing the season closer to their stony hearts. The heather on the slopes wore its fading purples and browns, and the rivers ran a little fuller with recent rain. When the Queen's car rolled up the familiar drive that year, the castle rose into view exactly as it always had, its grey stone turning soft and almost blue in the changing light. Yet, for those who watched closely, there was a difference that could not quite be named. She stepped out more carefully now. The stick in her hand was no longer just a small help, but a quiet necessity. The lines on her face were deeper, and the skin on her hands, as she lifted them in greeting, looked more fragile, like fine paper that had been folded and unfolded many times. Even so, when she breathed in that first lungful of Highland air, some of the old warmth flickered behind her eyes. The air tasted just as she remembered, cool and sharp, tinged with the smell of wet earth and distant pines. Somewhere beyond the trees, a dog barked with joyful impatience, and the call of a bird skimmed the surface of the sky. Inside the house, the familiar routine unfolded. Rooms were prepared, flowers arranged, small details checked and checked again. Staff moved with the special mix of efficiency and tenderness that comes when one serves not only a monarch, but an aging woman one has known for many years. Coats were hung, bags unpacked, and, as always, the scent of koi go began to drift through the corridors as fires were laid and lit against the evening chill. Soon enough, the house wore its old perfume again, a blend of laine ouate from damp cardigans and scarves, of polished wood, of cooking gently under control in the kitchens below. Outside, on evenings when the weather allowed, the ancient ritual of the open-air meal still tried to continue. The grill was lit, the coals turned slowly from black to glowing red. The tan kui chai cheo cheo, as fat, dripped down, sending up tiny sparks and tongues of flame. She no longer stood for long near the heat, but she liked to watch from a nearby chair, wrapped in a thick rug across her knees. The smoke reached her all the same, sliding through the air in lazy curls, settling into her clothes and hair. When a gust of wind blew a stronger thread of it toward her, she would sometimes close her eyes for a heartbeat, breathing it in as if it were an old song she loved, one she had heard every year for as long as she could remember. The family, sensing the preciousness of these days, drew a little closer around her. There were more gentle hands at her elbow, more careful eyes watching her steps, more quiet moments where conversation softened and slowed so that she would not have to strain to catch every word. Yet they did not wrap her in sorrow. Instead, they wrapped her in normalness. There was laughter at the table, small jokes, stories retold for the 100th time. Dogs nudged under her hand, pressing their warm heads into her palm. Outside, the hills kept their steady silence, the same as they had for generations, making no fuss over the fact that an old queen was spending what might be her last season under their watch. Inside Balmoral, the days arranged themselves into a gentle pattern. Mornings brought light filtering through curtains, the soft clink of breakfast dishes, the rustle of newspapers. Papers still came for her to read and sign. The ink of her signature still flowed in its neat familiar line. Duty, like a faithful companion, did not leave her side, even in these quieter hours. Yet there were longer pauses now between tasks, spaces where she simply sat and listened, to the tick of a clock, to the murmur of voices in another room, to the wind pressing its careful fingers along the window panes. In those pauses, Sandringham sometimes rose in her mind like a distant winter landscape. She remembered her father's last days, the thinness of his face, the way the house had seemed to hold its breath around him. She remembered the news reaching her far away, the sudden weight of being queen falling on her like new snow. Heavy and quiet? That house, with its frost and its pheasants and its low, pale skies, would always be tied to the beginning of her reign. But here, at Balmoral, the memories were of fullness rather than of endings. Philip at the grill, the children running through the heather, long walks taken in all kinds of weather, the constant presence of hills that had watched her transform from daughter to mother, from young sovereign to old. As her body grew more tired, she felt more strongly that this was where the long line of her days wanted to close its arc. The doctors who came and went at Balmoral in that September spoke in careful voices, their words wrapped in politeness and respect. They observed, they checked, they adjusted medicines, and they advised rest. Those closest to her could read in their faces what was not fully said, that the great tree of her life was slowly, gently bending toward the earth. Arrangements were discussed in quiet corners, travel plans reconsidered, schedules softened. The idea of rushing her back to London, to marble halls and sharp lights, flickered briefly and then faded like a match struck in a high wind. It was clear to those who truly knew her that the Highland air, the familiar stones, and the soft chorus of Muai Koi, Go Va Len Uhot, held more comfort now than any gilded ceiling ever could. Outside, the world continued to turn, largely unaware of just how delicate these days had become. Newspapers printed stories, cameras followed other events, People went about their lives under other skies. Yet here, within the grey walls of Balmoral, time had taken on a different weight. Each afternoon, light lying across the hills, each evening fire settling into embers, each cup of tea placed beside her hand felt like a small, quiet pearl threaded onto a necklace that was nearly complete. On some evenings, when the sky cleared, she could see the line of the hills sharply against the fading blue. The first stars would appear, small and timid at first, then braver as the dark deepened. In those moments, wrapped in a blanket, the faint smell of smoke in her hair, she might think of all the people who, in homes scattered across her realm and beyond, would one day hear that her journey had ended here. Some of them would imagine these very hills, this very sky, this very invisible cloak of mui koi, go and len wat around her shoulders. Perhaps they would picture her sitting exactly as she was now, small and still, but quietly at peace. The house, attuned to her in ways beyond words, seemed to gather itself around her more gently with each passing day. Floors creaked softly, as if stepping more carefully. Voices lowered, without being asked, doors closed, with greater kindness. The old stones in the walls had seen so much already. Births, visits, storms and summers. And now they prepared silently to witness something they had long known would come. And somewhere out beyond the last tree, where the lawns gave way to wild ground and the wild ground rose into the first true slopes of the highlands, the land itself seemed to lean in closer, as if listening for the moment when the long thread of her life would at last grow thin, not yet breaking, not yet gone, but drawing nearer to that tender point where one season ends and another, softer one begins, waiting patiently in the hush that settles just before the final page is turned. The day itself began, like many other days in the Highlands, wrapped in a soft, uncertain light that did not yet know whether it wanted to be bright or grey. Thin clouds drifted low over the hills, trailing their pale shadows across the heather and stone. The air outside Balmoral was cool and still, as if the land were taking a slow, careful breath. Inside the castle, the movements of the household were quiet, but there was a new weight beneath them, a heaviness that had nothing to do with the stones or the old wood. Those who served her had watched the small changes gather like distant clouds. She was more tired now, needed more rest, took fewer steps. Her doctors were close, their faces gentle and serious. They spoke softly in the corridors, glancing at the doors to her rooms with eyes that knew, even if their mouths stayed carefully calm. The scent of koi go drifted, as always, from the fireplaces, and the faint muai len wat still rose from coats drying by the door. But even these familiar smells seemed to carry a different echo, as if they were trying to hold on to something precious that was slowly slipping away. In her room, the light was not harsh. Curtains were half drawn so that only a soft grey brightness came through, smoothing the edges of furniture and picture frames. On the bedside table, there were small ordinary things, a glass of water, a folded handkerchief, perhaps a pair of glasses resting beside a book that would not be finished. Her breathing had grown shallower, her hands smaller and more delicate on the white sheet. The old strong thread of her life, stretched over so many years, was thinner now, but it still held. Outside those walls, the world began to sense that something important was stirring far away in Scotland. Messages passed quickly from phone to phone, from office to office. Newsrooms filled with a sudden hush as words like concern and under medical supervision appeared on screens and tickers. Across cities and small towns, people paused in their work, in their conversations, in their everyday worries, and turned their attention toward that one quiet house among the hills, where an old woman lay surrounded by doctors and family and the soft, careful ticking of a clock. At Balmoral, cars began to arrive, with unusual speed and urgency. The gravel on the drive crunched under the tyres as members of her family, called from their separate lives, came together. They stepped out into the Highland air, their faces tight with worry and love, their eyes lifted for a moment to the familiar shape of the castle before they went quickly inside. Some of them knew Balmoral best as a place of sunshine and laughter, of barbecues and long walks. Now they walked its halls in a different way, feeling the weight of each step, the press of time close behind them. In the room where she rested, the sounds were small and few. The rustle of clothing as someone shifted in a chair, the low murmur of a doctor's voice, the faint scrape of a cup on a saucer. Her chest rose and fell in gentle, uneven waves. Perhaps, in some far corner of her mind, she still heard the familiar music of this house, the wind under the eaves, the river beyond the trees, the soft song of Thang Kui Chai, Xiao Xiao, far away in another room where a fire was being kept for comfort. The air smelled of clean linen and something faintly sharp from the medicines, but underneath that, if one breathed in slowly, there was still the quiet perfume of smoke and wool that had wrapped itself around her life here for so many years. Far away in Norfolk, at Sandringham, the fields that had watched her father's last days lay under a different sky, not yet touched by evening. The pheasants went on with their simple routines, stepping through the grass, lifting suddenly into the air when startled, their wings beating hard against the wind. The house there stood as it always had, steady and patient, its bricks holding the memory of another passing long ago. In London, the streets and buildings seemed strangely normal and strange at the same time. Buses still ran, shops still opened, people still hurried across busy squares. Yet, as the news spread that her doctors were worried and that her family was gathering, a thin thread of unease pulled itself through offices and homes. People checked their phones more often, turned up the volume on televisions in waiting rooms, sent quick messages to friends and family with simple, heavy words. "Have you heard?" The hours moved slowly at Balmoral, even as they slid quickly by on clocks and watches. In the room, someone might have reached out to hold her hand, feeling the cool softness of her skin. Perhaps there were words spoken near her ear, words of love, gratitude, and farewell, murmured so softly that only she and the walls could hear them. Perhaps there were moments of complete silence, where everyone present simply listened to her breathing, to their own hearts, to the invisible crossing that lay somewhere just ahead. Outside, the hills did not change their posture. They had seen long lives and short lives, joys and sorrows, storms and long, golden evenings. They watched without blinking as the clouds passed over them and the first hints of late afternoon shadow began to gather in their folds. The river kept running, its voice never rising, never falling, just carrying on with its gentle, endless talk. When the moment finally came, it came as it does for almost everyone, quietly. There was no sudden flash of light, no great roaring sound. Her chest rose once more, then again, perhaps with a little effort, and then the next breath did not come. Her hand grew still in the one that held it. In that room, for a brief, fragile heartbeat, everything felt suspended. The clocks, the thoughts, even the air itself, as if the world were bowing its head. Then the moment passed, and reality settled gently into place. The long thread had reached its end. The Queen, who had once been a young girl hearing of her father's death at Sandringham, had now taken her own last breath at Balmoral, the home of her happiest days. Outside that small room, footsteps moved with new purpose. Messages were sent, calls were made. The house seemed to draw a deeper breath of its own, as if adjusting to a new shape of silence. The smell of koi go in the corridors was the same as before, but now it wrapped itself not only around chairs and curtains, but around the first tender memories of a day that would be remembered for generations, and far away in living rooms, on buses, in workplaces, on quiet beds where people lay with phones in their hands, the news began to spread, touching hearts one by one. Some felt a sudden tightness in their throat, some a slow sinking sadness, some a strange, hollow stillness. Many did what she had so often done in life. They looked not only toward London, but also, in their minds, toward two quiet homes. One in Norfolk, where a king's winter breath had once faded into silence, and one in Scotland, where the scent of len uot va koi, go now held the last gentle exhale of a queen. While outside both houses, the land listened in calm acceptance, ready to carry her story forward in stone, in air, and in the soft unfolding days of morning that were only just beginning to open. In the hours and days that followed her last quiet breath at Balmoral, the world outside that stone house seemed to move both very quickly and very slowly at the same time. News travelled at the speed of light, leaping from satellite to screen, from newsroom to living room, from one whispered conversation to another. Yet in the highland air around the castle, time felt thick and gentle, as if each second were wrapped in wool before it passed. The sky hung low over the hills, the clouds moving in long, pale ribbons that brushed the tops of the distant peaks. The river kept on speaking in its soft, endless murmur, and the trees stood in still lines, their leaves stirring only when a passing breeze asked them to. Inside Balmoral, the old routines folded themselves carefully away. The kitchen fires still burned, but the rhythm of cooking and serving changed. Footsteps in the corridors carried a different weight. Voices stayed low, even when no one was sleeping. The scent of koi go still drifted through the halls, yet now it seemed to mix with a new, almost invisible note, the fragile smell of fresh flowers being brought in and carried gently from room to room. On small tables, on mantels, in quiet corners, vases began to fill with blooms, sent in sorrow and gratitude. Their colours glowed softly in the muted light, like small lanterns set down to honour a long journey. In the room where she had died, the bed was straightened with great care, the pillows smoothed, the sheets drawn tight. The ordinary objects of her last days, a glass, a book, a pair of glasses, perhaps a scarf folded over a chair, were handled with a tenderness that went beyond duty. Those who had been closest to her knew that these little things held more than their simple shapes. They held the last touches of her hands, the last warmth of her gaze, the last quiet choices of a woman who had worn a crown for longer than many of them had been alive. Outside the castle walls, the first signs of public mourning began to appear almost at once. Along the gates of Balmoral, people started to gather, some from nearby villages, others who had driven from farther away as soon as they heard the news. They came in warm coats and old jumpers, their breath hanging in the cool air, their hands full of flowers and small handwritten notes. Many did not know exactly what to say. Some bowed their heads, some stood in silence with tears in their eyes, some whispered simple prayers into the wind. As they laid their flowers along the railings, the smell of petals and green stems joined the ever-present muai koi go that seeped out from the fires inside, creating a strange and gentle blend of garden and hearth. For many of those standing there, Balmoral had always been a distant, almost dreamlike place, a name in the news, a backdrop in photographs. Yet now, as they looked at the grey stone and the dark trees beyond, it felt much more real. They imagined her final days inside those walls, imagined the soft light in her room, the careful hands of her family and doctors, the quiet sounds that had kept her company. They pictured her wrapped in blankets, the faint scent of len, uat, and smoke still woven into her clothes from evenings by the fire. In their minds, this house became not just a royal residence, but a kind of great old-hearted friend who had cradled her gently at the end. Far to the south, at Sandringham, news of her passing moved like a soft, unseen wind through the estate. The fields where pheasants walked and flew, the woods that bordered the lawns, the rooms where her father had once taken his last breath, all seemed to lean slightly toward the north, as if listening. Those who worked there felt the echo of history beat against their own memories. They remembered that another reign had once ended in a quiet bedroom here, under a different sky, in another February. Now, the daughter who had stepped into her father's place had chosen a different house for her farewell, and the two estates were bound together more tightly than ever, like the first and last lines of the same long poem. As plans were made to bring her from Balmoral to the wider world for public mourning, the castle seemed to hold her just a little longer, as if reluctant to let her go. The air inside was heavy, with a respectful sadness, but also with a strange, tender peace. Those who walked the corridors could still smell the familiar comforts of the place: polished wood, old stone, the thin ribbon of koi go in the air. Yet now these scents seemed to rise like a blessing over the quiet, covered form that awaited its journey. In the courtyard, footsteps and hushed voices echoed off the stone walls as preparations were carried out. Vehicles stood ready. Protocols, practiced many times in theory, were now being followed for real. Yet even in the careful order of official plans, there was room for small, deeply human gestures. A hand laid briefly on a coffin, a bowed head, a single deep breath taken to steady the heart. When at last she began to leave Balmoral, carried from the house she loved most, the Highland air pressed close around the procession. The hills watched, unchanged but attentive, as the vehicles rolled slowly down the familiar drive. The trees along the road stood in quiet ranks, their branches forming a kind of natural guard of honour. Guards. On the grass and behind barriers, people of all ages gathered to say goodbye. Some held flags, some carried flowers, some stood with their hands linked. A deep, collective hush settled over them as the cortege passed. In that silence, the only sounds were the low hum of engines, the soft crunch of tyres on gravel, and the steady shuffling of feet as heads turned, following the slow movement. Many of those standing there thought not only of the Queen, but of the house itself, and of what it must feel like to let her go after so many summers and autumns together. They imagined the rooms growing suddenly emptier, the chairs by the fire sitting unoccupied, the faint muai, len uat, on old coats lingering without the owner who had worn them. Balmoral, they felt, would never be quite the same again. Yet, at the same time, they knew that her presence was now written into its stones too deeply to be erased. As the cortege moved further away, down the roads that would carry her first toward other Scottish cities, and then far beyond, the story of her passing continued to weave itself around the two estates that had shaped it. People spoke of her dying peacefully at Balmoral, repeating the words in homes and shops and buses, making the name of the Highland refuge sound like a lullaby. Others, remembering old stories, spoke of her father at Sandringham, and of how the reign that had begun with a winter ending in Norfolk had now closed with a late summer farewell in Scotland. And somewhere far away, perhaps in a darkened rooms with the curtains drawn and only a small lamp glowing, a listener who had followed these gentle tales might lie back on their pillow and picture it all. The grey stone of Balmoral under a soft sky, the long flat fields of Sandringham under winter light, the ever-present scent of koi go and len uot and tieng, then chui chai, sheo sheo, rising from remembered fires. In their mind, the Queen's story, the King's story, and the story of these two quiet houses would blur into one long, steady breath, in and out, until at last their own breathing slowed to match it, and somewhere, in the spaces between waking and sleep, another, deeper understanding of how places and people hold each other would begin to gently open, waiting for the next nights of remembrance to unfold. When her body left the Highlands and began its slow journey south, the land did not protest. It simply watched, as it had always watched, with that deep, patient gaze that belongs to old hills and old rivers. The cortege wound its way along narrow roads, lined with people who had gathered to say their quiet goodbyes. They stood in clusters, at village edges, on small bridges, on the shoulders of country lanes, their jackets zipped tight against the Scottish air. Many brought flowers, some brought nothing but themselves, and a silence they did not know how to put into words. As the hearse passed, a ripple of stillness moved through each crowd. Heads bowed, hands tightened around bouquets or clasped together. A few tears slipped down faces lined by years of their own stories. They did not stand in grand squares or beneath gilded ceilings. They stood by stone walls and hedgerows, by fields and churches, the everyday places of their lives. Yet in their hearts, many of them saw not only the vehicle passing by, but also the house from which it had come, the grey stone of Balmoral softened by cloud. The smell of koi go and len uot folded into its rooms. They imagined the empty chair by the fire, the unoccupied place at the small familiar table, the coat that still held a ghost of her scent, hanging quietly on its hook. As the road carried her away from the Highlands, the light shifted slowly from the wild softness of that landscape toward the more ordered patterns of towns and cities. Yet, in some quiet corner inside her children and grandchildren, Balmoral walked with them still. They carried its air in their memories, the cool bite of the wind on morning walks, the sound of river water over stone, the thin ribbon of smoke rising from an outdoor grill where Tangkui Chai Cheo Cheo had once sung its gentle, hungry song. Even as they travelled south, the Highland home clung to them like the smell of smoke and wool, a lingering presence that would not easily fade. Farther away, in Norfolk, the news had already seeped into the soil of Sandringham like a light, steady rain. The estate carried on its daily life, gardens tended, paths swept, animals fed, but under everything there was a sense of listening. Those who worked there felt the tug of memory each time they passed the rooms where George VI had spent his final days. The air in those spaces seemed to grow a little heavier with remembrance, as if the house understood that the long arc which had begun with a father's last breath here had now found its closing note far to the north. In the cottages and small houses around Sandringham, people sat at their own tables and thought about how strange and gentle that pattern was. A king ending his days in winter among the pheasants and low skies of Norfolk, his daughter choosing instead the embrace of Scottish hills and the perfume of wet wool and wood smoke at Balmoral. The nation's formal mourning unfolded in cathedrals and palaces, in long queues and whispered prayers, but beneath all the ceremony, the image of those two private estates glowed steadily like coals under ash. When reporters spoke of her final days at Balmoral, the word carried with it much more than geography. Listeners imagined the cool, grey light on the stone walls, the soft press of mist on the hills, the smell of rain-damp heather, and the familiar muai koi go drifting through corridors. They pictured the Queen in her simple headscarf and sturdy coat, walking slowly along a path with her dogs at her heels, unaware in those earlier summers that the place where she felt most at ease would one day cradle her last breath. And when older voices remembered aloud that her father had died at Sandringham, a different picture appeared. Frosted lawns, bare trees drawn against a pale winter sky, pheasants calling sharply in the cold air, and a king finding his final moments of peace, not in a golden hall, but in a quiet room overlooking fields he had walked since boyhood, in homes with their own small fires, as people watched the endless coverage. There were moments when the scent of their everyday lives, tea brewing, bread toasting, the faint smell of their own coy bep, seemed to blend in imagination with the invisible aromas of those royal houses. Someone wrapped in a worn jumper might notice the faint muai len uot from yesterday's rain and feel for a heartbeat unexpectedly close to Balmoral. Someone walking a dog in a frosty field might hear the sudden rush of a bird's wings and think of Sandringham's pheasants breaking the morning silence. In this way, the two estates stepped quietly out of the distant world of royalty and into the shared human landscape of memory and feeling. For the royal family, the days passed in a blur of duty and grief. There were formal processions, solemn services, lines of people stretching far into the night, all wanting to say goodbye to the woman who had been their queen for so long. Yet even as they walked behind her coffin through city streets, hearing the muffled drum beats and the slow, measured steps of guards, somewhere at the back of their minds they could still hear other sounds, the crunch of gravel in Balmoral's drive, the soft bark of dogs in its courtyard, the rustle of wind in the trees at Sandringham, the quiet flurry of wings as pheasants lifted in surprise from the hedgerows. These private noises, small and homely, floated behind the great public music of morning, like a hidden melody only they could hear. For many, watching from afar, it became clear that the story of her reign could not be told only through images of London. Yes, there were balconies and gilded coach wheels, grand banquets and great state occasions, but there were also muddy boots at the back door of Balmoral, and the smell of coal smoke in the halls of Sandringham, and the faint, comforting scratch of a wool blanket pulled up against a Highland chill. These details, shared in photographs and interviews, in soft-voiced documentaries, slowly melted the distance between crown and cottage. People who had never set foot on Scottish soil or Norfolk paths felt, in their own quiet way, that they knew these places through smell and sound and imagined touch. As the great formal farewell moved toward its final stages, a strange kind of comfort began to settle in the minds of many who mourned her. It was the comfort of knowing that, in the end, she had gone not in a hard, bright room full of mirrors and ceremony, but in a house that smelled of smoke and wool and rain, not in a city that never slept, but in a valley where the hills closed in protectively, where the river hummed its low, constant song, where the sky leaned close enough to touch. And for those who thought of her father, gone so many years before, there was comfort in the thought that he too had been allowed a final season in the place he loved best, with the Norfolk winter pressing softly at the windows, the pheasants calling in the fields, and the quiet dignity of an ordinary room holding the extraordinary weight of a king's last breath. So the two estates, once simply private refuges, had become, by the gentle logic of time and endings, like two bookends on the shelf of a long reign, Sandringham at the start, Balmoral at the close. Between them lay decades of history, but also a simple human truth, that even those who wear crowns seek, in their deepest hearts, the same things everyone else does: familiar walls, known paths, the smell of fires and rain and wool, and a piece of land that feels, beyond all titles and duties, like home. And somewhere in the quiet, after the great ceremonies, when the cameras had turned away and the streets had emptied, the question began to arise like a distant, low note in a song. What would become now of these two houses of memory, these places steeped in Coy Go, Len Wat, and the deep, unspoken stories of a family and a nation? As the seasons turned again, and new footsteps began to echo in old rooms, gently changing their music, while the walls continued to keep their secrets in the dark. In the months that followed, the final ceremonies, when the black clothes were put away and the great crowds went back to their everyday lives, Sandringham and Balmoral remained where they had always been, quiet and steady under their separate skies. The news moved on to other stories, other troubles and joys, but the two estates kept their gentle watch, holding within their walls and fields the fresh layer of memory that had settled over them. For the new king and his family, returning to these places was both comforting and strange. The roads were the same, the bends and hedgerows unchanged, yet the air itself seemed to carry a different note. When the new monarch's car turned into the Sandringham Drive on a cold day, the house rose ahead, just as it always had, its brick and stone warmed by the low winter light. The trees stood bare against the sky, and in the fields beyond, pheasants still stepped carefully through the stubbled grass, their feathers glowing with small bursts of colour in the pale sun. But inside, as he walked the corridors, the absence of her presence moved beside him like a silent companion. The familiar smell of polished wood, coal dust and old stone was still there, yet it seemed now to belong as much to her as to the house itself. In the room where George VI had once spent his last days, and which had always been a quiet shrine in the family's mind, another layer of meaning had settled like soft dust. This was no longer just the house where a reign had begun. It was now also the house that had watched from afar as that same reign ended among the hills. The thought was like a thread drawn between Norfolk's frosted lawns and Scotland's misty slopes, tying them both to the story of a single life that had passed through them in different seasons. When the family gathered again for Christmas at Sandringham, as she had done so often, the rituals took on a new shape. The tree still glittered softly in the drawing room, lights casting tiny reflections in the glass of framed photographs. Cards were arranged on mantels, fires burned in the grates, and the smell of roasting food drifted in comforting waves from the kitchens. Yet around the table there was an empty space where everyone still felt her presence, the memory of her voice reading out small notes, her laugh at some familiar joke, the way she had always seemed to anchor the room, even in quiet moments. Outside, the winter air bit at cheeks as they took their traditional walks, boots crunching on gravel or soft earth, breath clouding in the cold. Somewhere at the far edge of a field, a pheasant would suddenly burst from cover with a noisy flutter of wings, and for a heartbeat, someone might think of the stories told about how her father had watched such birds in his last days, and how she herself had remembered him there. In this way, Sandringham continued to weave its calm, winter-scented thread through the lives of a new generation, holding its memories gently but firmly. Balmoral, when the family returned in late summer, felt both heartbreakingly familiar and quietly transformed. The drive up through the Highlands still offered the same views of rising hills and shifting light. The heather still spread its purples and browns over the slopes, and the rivers still traced their silver paths between rocks and roots. Yet when the castle came into sight, its grey stone seemed to carry a new depth, as if the shadows between its blocks had been darkened by grief and love. Stepping out of the car, the new king and his family breathed in the same cool air she had loved, sharp with pine, sweet with wet earth, touched by the faint thread of Coy Go drifting from some early fire. The smell of Len Uot rose again on rainy days from coats hung in familiar places, and the fireplaces once more filled the rooms with the soft song of burning logs. Tan, kui chai, chao chao, under outdoor grills, on the rare dry evenings, sending up sparks and smoke into the highland sky. Children and dogs ran across the grass, their shouts and barks echoing against the stone walls just as they had in years past. Yet in quiet moments, when the house fell still and only the ticking clocks and the low wind could be heard, her absence was a presence of its own. The chair she had favoured near a particular window, the path she had walked most often, the spots where she had stood for photographs that now hung in nearby frames, all of these touched the hearts of those who lived there now. They carried her in their thoughts as they moved through rooms that had watched her change from a young woman to an old one, from a new queen to a beloved, long-serving figure whose last breath had fallen into the very air they were breathing. Over time, the estates began to settle into their new roles without losing their old ones. Sandringham remained the place of winter gatherings, of quiet fields and pheasants, and the lingering memory of a king's last days. Balmoral remained the summer and autumn refuge, its hills holding the echo of barbecues, dogs, children, and a queen's final rest. Yet they were now also teaching themselves to be something more, living bridges between the past and the future, places where new footsteps would echo alongside old ones. For the people who watched from afar, these changes became clear in small ways. A new face standing in front of a familiar doorway in a Christmas broadcast from Sandringham, a new figure in a headscarf and practical coat walking the paths of Balmoral, smiling at the dogs, looking out at the hills. In each of these images, there was a sense of continuity that soothed something deep in the collective heart. The houses were still there, the fires still burned. The smell of koi, go, and lan uot still wove through their rooms. The pheasants still called in Norfolk, and the rivers still whispered in Scotland. Life, though changed, was carrying on. In quiet bedrooms and small apartments, in farmhouses and city flats, people lying awake at night sometimes thought of these places when their own thoughts felt too loud. They imagined themselves walking slowly along Balmoral's misty paths, feeling the dampness of the air on their cheeks, hearing the distant river and the crunch of gravel underfoot. They pictured the warm glow of a window at Sandringham on a cold evening, the soft light spilling out onto the dark lawn, promising warmth and shelter inside. In their minds, the estates became not only royal homes but also gentle resting places for their own worries, landscapes they could visit in thought before sleep, where the long stories of a family and a nation unfolded in calm, steady lines. And within the walls of both houses, as the seasons turned and the years moved forward, a new understanding quietly took root, that places, like people, can grieve and heal and grow. Sandringham and Balmoral had known endings and beginnings, laughter and tears, arrivals and departures. Now they were learning to hold all of it at once, to keep the memory of a king and a queen while also opening their doors to new days and new stories, which were only just beginning to be written in the soft language of footsteps, smoke, wool and wind, even as somewhere beyond the next hill and the next winter, other questions slowly formed about how these quiet royal refugees would continue to shape the hearts of those who came after, and what hidden corners of their gardens and rooms still waited to share their secrets under the watchful gaze of trees and stars. As the years began to fold gently over the fresh grief of her passing, the stories of Sandringham and Balmoral slowly settled into a new shape in the minds of those who loved to think of them. They were no longer just the settings of a present queen's quiet days. They had become places of remembrance, almost like great living books that people could walk through. Visitors came in careful streams, not in noisy crowds, but in the soft, respectful trickle of those who wished to stand for a few heartbeats where history and ordinary life had once shared the same air. At Sandringham, on certain days, the gates opened to let them pass along its paths. They walked under pale English skies, clouds drifting like thin, slow waves overhead. The air carried the scent of damp soil and clipped hedges, and even if no pheasant showed itself that day, people looked toward the fields, as if expecting at any moment the sudden explosion of wings they had heard about in stories. They stepped softly through rooms that had been carefully arranged, seeing polished wood framed photographs and simple chairs that had once held heavy thoughts and tired bodies. In some corners, the rooms felt almost untouched, as if the king who had died there and the queen who had mourned him still might walk in at any moment. The ticking of old clocks filled the silence like gentle, patient voices. For many visitors, the thought that a monarch had spent his last days here did not feel grand at all. It felt strangely familiar, like the memory of a grandparent whose final winter had been spent in a favourite armchair by a small fire. Sandringham helped people understand that even kings could fade in quiet rooms under ordinary blankets with the same fragile breath that would one day leave every human chest. Balmoral, too, opened its doors in careful, limited ways, allowing people to trace short pieces of the Queen's long private map. They came up the drive and saw the castle rise among the trees, its grey stone softened by the Highland light. The air felt different here, sharper, cleaner, carrying the green breath of pines and the faint tang of distant rain. On some days, mist hugged the hills, wrapping them in soft, shifting veils. On other days, the sky was wide and blue, and the light lay like a gentle hand on the heather. Visitors walked through certain rooms, seeing fireplaces where logs had burned low on countless evenings, shelves lined with books, and walls dressed with photographs of smiling faces in tweed and wool. They might catch, in their imagination, if not always in their noses, the lingering mui koi go that seemed to cling forever to the stones here, and perhaps, if the weather had been wet, they recognised the faint ghost of Len Uot in their own coats and jumpers, feeling for a moment as if they had stepped inside the memory of her favourite season. Guides spoke in low tones, explaining which paths she had liked to walk, which windows she had favoured in the evenings when the hills began to fade into dusk. People listened, eyes turned toward the glass, imagining her small figure sitting there, a blanket over her knees, a dog at her feet, the slow rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed in the Highland air. For some, these details made her feel closer than any crown ever had. It was not the glitter of jewels that touched their hearts, but the thought of wool, smoke, rain, and stone holding her like an old friend. In living rooms far away, people who might never visit either estate still found themselves returning to them in thought, especially in the quiet hours of evening. After long days of work or worry, they would sit or lie down, letting their minds drift north and east along invisible lines. They imagined the flat fields of Sandringham under a pale winter sky, frost clinging to the grass, bare trees standing like thin ink-drawn sentries. They pictured the sudden burst of pheasants taking flight, wings beating hard against the cold air, their colours bright and startled against the muted ground. They saw a window glowing softly in the brick facade, a square of golden light, promising warmth inside, and behind it, a simple room where someone sat alone with their thoughts. Then, with a gentle shift, their thoughts would travel to Balmoral, rising with the land into the high, breathing hills. They imagined walking along a narrow path barred by heather, the ground springy underfoot, the air cool against their cheeks. Somewhere ahead, smoke would be lifting from an outdoor fire, coals glowing red and orange as than kui shai, xeo xeo, under whatever meal was being prepared. The smell of koi, go, and len wat would wrap around them, comforting and a little wild at the same time. They would see, in their mind's eye, a small group gathered near the flames, talking quietly, laughter rising now and then, like birds startled, into the air. And somewhere slightly apart, on a simple chair or a low wall, a familiar figure would sit in a headscarf and coat, watching the hills with that steady, gentle gaze that had seen so many years. These nighttime journeys, taken in imagination, became a kind of shared ritual for people who had never met one another. Without knowing it, they walked the same invisible routes in their minds, moving between the winter quiet of Sandringham and the highland calm of Balmoral. In this way, the two estates continued to do what they had always quietly done for the family who lived there. They offered a sense of refuge, of steady ground to people whose own lives felt uncertain or noisy. Even children, hearing simplified versions of these stories, sometimes found comfort in them. The idea that a queen had favourite houses, favourite chairs, favourite smells just like anyone else made the large world of history feel smaller and kinder. They could easily picture her as an elderly lady with sore feet and a soft blanket, listening to the wind at the window or to the soft tatters of rain on the roof. They understood that the pheasants at Sandringham were not royal birds at all, but simple creatures startled into flight by footsteps in the grass. They smiled at the thought of than kui chai, xeo xeo, under royal sausages at Balmoral, sending up sparks like tiny stars. And perhaps lying in their own beds at night, these children learned without being told that even the tallest stories are made of small human details. The new generations of the royal family, growing up with these stories already woven into their lives, began to create their own layers on top of the old ones. They learned which paths felt best underfoot, which corners of each house were the quietest, which windows caught the last light of evening in the gentlest way. Sometimes they walked where she had once walked, their smaller footprints falling inside the faint memory of hers. Sometimes they chose new routes, new chairs, new favourite spots by the fire. The houses did not mind. They had room for all of it. Sandringham's winters continued to wrap the estate in cold silver light, while Balmoral's summers and autumns painted the hills in shifting greens, purples and browns. Smoke continued to rise from chimneys and grills. Wool continued to drink in rain and dry again by warm hearths, and the quiet music of clocks, wind, rivers and birds stitched the days together one by one. And somewhere in the soft, overlapping edges of past and present, the spirits of those who had loved these places most seemed to walk beside the living, not as ghosts to be feared, but as gentle echoes of footsteps on old floors, as half-remembered laughter in the corner of a room, as a sudden tender longing when the scent of koi, go or len uot drifted unexpectedly through the air, hinting that there were still more quiet truths to be found in these houses of stone and sky. As the story of Sandringham and Balmoral continued to unwind itself slowly and softly into whatever lay ahead. In the quiet unfolding of the years, Sandringham and Balmoral slowly began to feel less like places fixed in the past and more like bridges stretching gently into the future. The old stories did not fade. They simply settled deeper into the foundations, leaving space on the surface for new footsteps, new voices, new small ordinary moments that would one day become memories for others. The land around both houses continued its slow, patient work of changing and remaining the same. At Sandringham, winters still wrapped the estate in a pale silver calm. Frost lay in delicate patterns along the grass, turning each blade into a tiny shard of glass. The ponds skimmed over with thin ices that cracked softly under the weight of a boot. In the early mornings, long before most people were awake, pheasants still stepped through the hedgerows with their nervous, jerky movements, their feathers catching what little light the sky offered. Sometimes, when a car or a distant voice startled them, they burst into the air in a noisy rush, their wings beating against the cold as if they were shaking off the chill of the world. For the new king, walking those fields in the half-light, there was a strange comfort in these unchanged rhythms. He knew that his mother had watched these same birds, that his grandfather had known the same sharp bite of Norfolk air on his cheeks. The house behind him, with its familiar windows and chimneys, now held 3 layers of endings and beginnings: the passing of a king, the long reign of a queen, and the quiet, steady steps of a new monarch who carried all of their stories in his heart. Inside Sandringham, fires still burned in grates when the weather turned harsh, sending the gentle perfume of coal and wood through the corridors. The smell of coy go mixed with the scents of polish, old books, and the faint sweetness of flowers arranged in vases. Portraits watched from the walls, their painted eyes reflecting the changing generations who walked beneath them. Sometimes, during a silent moment by the fire, the new king or another member of the family might find themselves listening for footsteps that would never come again, or glancing up with the strange, sudden feeling that someone they loved was still just around the corner. Yet, the house did not feel haunted in a frightening way. It felt full, like a well-read book whose pages were still soft from being turned many times. Balmoral, too, continued its ancient conversation with the sky and the hills. In spring, the grass grew vivid and bright, and small flowers lifted their faces toward the light. In summer, the days stretched long, the sun hovering above the horizon as if reluctant to leave. In autumn, the heather turned the slopes into deep, smoky purples and browns, and the trees let their leaves fall one by one, laying a rustling carpet along the paths. In winter, snow sometimes came and covered everything in a quiet, muffled white, making the castle look like something from a dream. Through all these changes, the castle itself stood unchanged in its outlines, its grey stone carrying the soft stain of rain and time. The smell of len uot and koi go was never far from its rooms. On wet days, coats and scarves, heavy with rain, were hung near doors and radiators, releasing that familiar mua len uot into the air. On colder evenings, logs burned in fireplace after fireplace, their than kui chai, cheo cheo, singing the same calm song it had sung for decades. The smoke curled up chimneys into the highland air, tracing invisible lines between the private life within and the wide, watchful world outside. The new generations learned to read these scents and sounds the way their parents and grandparents had. For them, the smell of wool and smoke was not only a sign of comfort, it was a sign of continuity, proof that the house still knew how to be what it had always been. A refuge, a place where crowns could be set aside for a while in favour of muddy boots and shared meals. They walked the familiar paths with new eyes, sometimes thinking of the old stories as if they were gentle ghosts walking beside them. On a certain bend in a trail, they might imagine her small figure in a headscarf, dogs trotting happily at her heels. In a quiet corner of the garden at Sandringham, they might picture a king pausing to catch his breath, hands buried deep in his coat pockets against the Riu Gio Lan. These imagined scenes did not weigh them down. They held them up like hands at their backs, reminding them that they were not starting from nothing but carrying something forward. Beyond the royal family, people across the country and far beyond its borders continued to weave Sandringham and Balmoral into their own private maps of comfort. For those lying awake In city apartments, lulled by the distant hum of traffic, the thought of a frost-covered Norfolk field or a misty Scottish hillside could soften the sharp edges of their worries. They could almost feel the crunch of gravel underfoot, or the soft, springy give of heather-covered ground. They could almost smell the mix of koi bep in their own kitchen and the imagined muai koi go drifting through Balmoral's stone halls. Somewhere in the dark, someone might close their eyes and picture themselves wrapped in a thick, scratchy blanket that smelled faintly of len uot and smoke, sitting by a fire while rain tapped at the window. They might imagine a quiet figure in another chair, someone who had carried heavy burdens with a light, steady hand, and feel for a moment that they were keeping each other company in the gentle silence. Over time, stories began to be told not only about what had happened in these houses, but about what they meant. Sandringham came to stand, in many hearts, for the idea that even the most powerful lives end in small human ways, in bedrooms, in winter light, under blankets, and beside windows that look out over fields. It reminded people that being important in the eyes of the world does not protect anyone from tired lungs, from slowly failing hearts, from the soft final breath that leaves the chest quiet. Balmoral, in turn, came to stand for the idea of chosen peace, of finding, in a world full of noise and duty, a place where one could walk among trees and rivers and hills and feel their own weight held kindly by the land. For the Queen, it had been the place where she could be most herself. An old woman in practical clothes, loving dogs and weather, and the simple joy of sitting with family by a smoky fire. For those who never met her, that idea was comforting in its own right. It suggested that beneath titles and ceremonies, she had sought the same gentle things that they did. Familiar paths, warm rooms, kind faces, and the soothing touch of nature. And so as calendar pages turned and new dates took their places on walls and screens, Sandringham and Balmoral remained like two steady lanterns at the edge of people's thoughts. One shone with the pale light of winter mornings and the echo of pheasants in cold air. The other glowed with the deep colours of highland evenings and the scent of koi go and len uot wrapped around stone and wool. Together, they formed a quiet arch over the long story of a king and his daughter, of beginnings and endings separated by decades, but joined by the same longing for home. Somewhere, in the soft space between waking and sleep, listeners could still walk between them, letting the hush of fields and hills flow slowly through their minds, while just beyond the horizon of this tale, another final night waited, ready to gather all these threads into a single gentle reflection, like a last deep breath before rest. The last night of this long, quiet journey through fields and hills, through stone houses and soft, smoky rooms, the story of Sandringham and Balmoral settles like evening light over a landscape that has finally grown still. The two estates, so different and yet so deeply joined, now lie side by side in the memory of anyone who has followed their gentle thread. Sandringham, with its flat Norfolk fields and pale winter sky, still breathes in slow, cool draughts of air each morning, frost trembling along the grass like tiny crystals of glass. Pheasants still stir in the hedgerows, their small bodies tense and alert, their wings ready to burst against the cold silence at the slightest sound. Balmoral, far to the north, still sleeps and wakes among the rising folds of the Highlands, the hills breathing beneath low clouds, the river whispering over stones in an endless patient song. Nothing in the land has changed its rhythm. The wind still strokes the trees, the rain still taps at the windows, the snow still falls in soft, secret layers. Yet for those who know the stories held in these places, the air around them feels fuller, carrying not only the sense of earth and weather, but also the faint echo of lives that have passed through, leaving warmth behind them like handprints on old wood. Somewhere between the two estates, in the wide unseen space of memory, the figures of a king and a queen walk as gently as shadows. The king moves through Sandringham's winter paths, his breath forming small clouds before him, his steps sometimes slowing as the weight of his body and his years presses down. He knows the sound of the pheasants rising in sudden noisy bursts, the thin crack of ice beneath his boots near the ponds, the smell of coal smoke hanging low in the chilly corridors of the house. He knows, too, the quiet honesty of the rooms, where he could be simply a man who tired easily, who sat near the fire with a blanket over his knees, and listened to the wind knock softly at the windows. The Queen, in turn, moves along Balmoral's winding tracks, her hand resting lightly on a walking stick, her headscarf tied against the unpredictable Highland breeze. She knows the feel of heather brushing against her legs, the sound of the river's distant murmur, the sudden gust of smoke from an outdoor fire, where thankui chai, cheo cheo, under sausages and chops, the smell of koi, go, and len uat has sunk into her clothes so deeply that it follows her even when she steps inside, wrapping around her like an invisible shawl. She knows the comfort of a small room with a view of the hills, of a dog asleep at her feet, of a simple chair by the window where the light fades slowly and kindly at the end of the day. These two lives, separated by time yet bound by blood and duty, now feel as if they are stitched into the very fabric of the estates themselves. For those who walk at Sandringham, there may always be a sense that a king's last breath still lingers near the windows that overlook the fields, that the corridors remember his quiet courage in the face of pain and responsibility. For those who visit Balmoral, there may always be the soft feeling that a queen's presence still rests in the chairs by the fire and in the paths that climb gently toward the hills, that the stones themselves have learned the shape of her footsteps and keep it safe beneath every new layer of time. And between them, for the people who have listened to these tales, there grows a tender understanding that even the grandest stories are built from very small human details. The scratch of a wool blanket against tired skin, the steady ticking of a clock on a mantle, the soft rattle of branches against glass on a windy night. Perhaps the deepest mystery of these royal houses is not their wealth or their age, but the way they show that, in the end, kings and queens seek the same things everyone else does. They long for rooms where they can sit in peace, for paths they know by heart, for the smell of familiar fires and the sound of familiar voices. They carry crowns before crowds and cameras, but in private they wrap themselves in wool against the cold, watch the weather from their windows, and sigh with quiet relief when the day's duties are done. In this way, Sandringham and Balmoral become like mirrors for anyone who thinks of them at night. The listener lying in a small bedroom far away, perhaps with traffic humming in the distance, or a fan turning slowly overhead, can close their eyes and visit these places in their imagination. They can walk through the frosted fields of Norfolk, hearing the startled rush of pheasants in the half-light of morning, feeling the sting of cold on their cheeks. They can climb the gentle slopes around Balmoral, their steps light on the heather, the air cool and clean in their lungs. They can sit beside a fire whose logs whisper softly as they burn, the room dim except for the glow of embers, the smell of koi go va len uot settling around them like a soft, heavy cloak. In these imagined journeys, the listener discovers that they, too, are part of the story, that the longing for a quiet, safe place is not something that belongs only to royalty, but to every heart that has ever grown tired and wished for rest. And so, as this tale reaches its end, the two estates stand side by side in the night of the mind, one wrapped in winter stillness, one cradled in Highland mist. The king at Sandringham has long since closed his eyes. The queen at Balmoral has followed him into that same deep, gentle darkness. Their houses remain, keeping watch, their walls holding the warmth of old fires and the faint imprint of hands that will never touch them again. Outside, the stars shine over Norfolk fields and Scottish hills alike, small and steady above the sleeping earth. Inside countless rooms across the world, other lights are slowly being turned off, other blankets drawn up, other eyes growing heavy as the last words of this story fall into a soft, lingering silence. Somewhere in that silence, it is easy to imagine a quiet voice offering thanks for the long lives lived under changing skies, for the courage of those who carried crowns, and for the simple grace of the houses that held them when they were most human. And then, as the listener's breathing slows and the line between waking and dreaming blurs, the fields of Sandringham and the hills of Balmoral drift gently away into the soft darkness, like distant shores seen from a slowly rocking boat, leaving behind only a feeling of calm and a faint comforting trace of smoke and wool in the air, as if the story itself had laid a warm cloak over the shoulders of the night and whispered, with a kindness as old as stone and as light as falling snow, that it is all right now to close your eyes, to rest, and to let the quiet world of kings and queens, pheasants and Highland fires fade softly into sleep,